James Dunker. You are a professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of Waterloo right here in Canada, and you are a cognitive neuroscientist. You are an expert on the psychology of boredom, and to fight your own boredom, you co-wrote this book called Out of My Skull, The Psychology of Boredom. James, thank you so much for being here today.
It's my pleasure, Alain.
So, James, I used to have a social life. Like I'm a salsa dancer, I dance tango, I like networking events, and I'm an extrovert. But now, due to COVID-19, I'm bored out of my skull, and I hope you will give me some suggestion on how not to commit suicide. I wonder if you could tell us, first of all, a little bit about yourself, and then how you became interested in the topic of boredom.
I feel your pain, Alain. I don't do the salsa dancing. My wife and I do swing dancing though, and it's a very big sort of community thing to do, isn't it? And so it's hard to miss that kind of connection with people. So I understand your pain. Um, yeah, there's a couple of things that got me interested in boredom. I think one of them is this notion of physician heal thyself. A lot of psychologists study things they're bad at, right? So people who have poor memories might study, how the brain controls our memories and so on. For me, I experience boredom a lot more than I would like to. And, even before the pandemic. And so that was one of the motivating factors to try and understand it. And when I was a younger man, I used to think that maybe I could outrun it, but I don't believe that anymore. But I do think that I can understand it better and perhaps cope better. And then the other thing is that a more personal experience. When I was much younger, about 19, my older brother, who was only 18 months older than me, had a serious motor vehicle accident. And in part during his recovery, he would complain of boredom. And it struck me that the boredom he was experiencing, he was not finding pleasure in things that he used to love before the brain injury that he suffered as a consequence of his car accident. And it struck me that this was a change, an organic change in his brain and how his brain calculated reward and value and so on. And so I got very interested in that for that reason. And then I trained as a clinical neuropsychologist in Australia. And I would assess people who'd had similar brain injuries to my brother. And I would ask these people, typically young men who'd been in motor vehicle accidents or barroom fights, and they'd suffered these head injuries. I would ask them, do you feel more bored now than you did before your brain injury? And to a number, they all said yes. And they didn't just say yes. They were sort of happy that someone had finally asked them about this important change in their lives, that, post brain injury, they were having a hard time engaging with the world in a meaningful way or in ways that they used to be able to before their head injury. And so those are the two main things that really got me interested in trying to understand boredom and what happens in the brain when we're bored.
Well, yesterday I was listening to an issue of The Economist, and they were talking about how people with brain injuries also have a higher tendency of ending up in prison, and also having violence, committing violent crimes. So that's that's
Yeah,
I.
there's one of the classic things about having a brain injury to the front part of your brain, at the very least, the frontal cortex, is sort of impulse control and behavioral control. And so these patients will often have higher rates of aggression, and that can land you in trouble, right? They also have higher rates of drug and alcohol use and higher rates of depression. And all of those things are also associated with being boredom prone. So if you're highly prone to experiencing boredom, you also have higher rates of depression, higher rates of drug and alcohol use, higher rates of aggression. So, and particularly a particular kind of aggression. So people who are boredom prone tend to be hostile. And it's that they feel like the interactions that they're having with the world and the people in it are not satisfying. And so they're sort of hostile to those relations.
Well, does this apply? I mean, we spoke about brain injuries, but that could also apply to people in sports like boxing, football, hockey. They are constantly banging each other's head.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I mean, we know this from people who've suffered from chronic traumatic encephalopathy as a function of those sports, particularly football, but hockey as well, that they report higher rates of depression, but also, problems in sort of regulating their behavior. They get more aggressive, and that causes them some troubles in their relations and so on. And so, yeah, it's a serious problem.
Okay, so you were interested in this subject so much that you decided to make this a career. Is that how it went, or...
Well, not quite. I mean, as I said, I initially trained as a clinical neuropsychologist, and what that job is that clinical neuropsychologists will assess people who've had brain injuries to try and characterize what challenges they might be facing, and then also to try and make plans to help them rehabilitate and regain control over their lives, and so and to live independently and all that kind of thing. So I initially trained in that capacity, and I did a lot of research in attention. How do we control and deploy our attention on various tasks, which is related a bit to the traumatic brain injury stuff. And I think I moved away from working in the clinical side of things to being just fascinated with research in general. So the way that happened was that when you do PhD in Australia, you're so far away from the rest of the world that what you get encouraged to do is to leave after you've finished. You sort of leave the nest. And I did that. I finished my PhD in Australia in 1999. And then I moved to London, Ontario, and did some postdoctoral research work with a guy called Mel Goodale. And it was there that I just fell in love with research in general and decided that I wanted to pursue a career in research. It was also there that I met my Canadian wife. And so we ended up sort of sticking around and making our life here rather than moving back to Australia. So it took me a while before I was able to have the resources and the personnel to start researching boredom. My brother's motor vehicle accident was in 1991. I didn't publish on boredom until 2005. And so it took a while to get that all where I wanted it to be, but now it's prominently the one of the main things that I research.
Right. Okay. So I forgot to ask you. So you are from Australia. So you are
Yep.
still under the Queen's tutelage subject of the...
Yeah.
Okay, and so you are doing this research, and then at what moment you decide to write a book about it? And thankfully enough, a book for us lame people who don't know all your scientific language and who are able to understand your thoughts.
Yeah. So a couple of years ago, I was approached by an editor, and they asked whether or not I would be willing to write a book about boredom. And I think that my co-author, John Eastwood, he had been asked by a different publishing house whether or not he would write a book on boredom about a year earlier. And he said no, because he didn't, a year or two earlier. He said no because he didn't think that the research was ready at that point. But when I got asked, I contacted John because he and I knew each other pretty well. And at that point, we sort of decided, yeah, I mean, I think it's ripe now to bring what we know together and to get it to the general public. It's interesting that you make that point that the book is for the general public. As a scientist, we need to do more of that kind of thing, because you know who pays my salary and who pays for my research? The general public, right?
Good.
So we need to give back in the sense of we need to talk about what we do and why it's important and why they should keep paying our salaries, I guess. But yeah, it was just about feeling that the time was right, because up until about the last 10 years, there wasn't quite so many people researching boredom, but now there's quite a lot. And there's a lot of people who are interested in it, a lot of people who are doing some really innovative and interesting work. And so we thought it was a good time to bring it together.
Okay, well, then let's bring it to the essentials. What exactly is boredom? Because what could be boring for me is not necessarily boring to somebody else.
That's an excellent point. I liken boredom to happiness in that way, right? What makes you happy won't make another person happy either, right? It's unique to you. And so if I go back and try and define what boredom is, the quote I love to start with is from Leo Tolstoy in Anna Karenina. And he calls boredom the desire for desires. So when we're bored, we are in a motivated state where we want something to engage with. We want something that's meaningful and purposeful to us. That's the part that is, unique to you. It has to matter to you. It can't matter to somebody else. We want something like that to engage in, but we don't want anything that's right in front of us. And so that's a sort of a tension, a kind of conundrum of I know I can feel in myself that I want something, but I can't want anything that's easily available to me. And the anecdote that I think makes the sense to a lot of people who have their own children at least, is that, if you've got a young child that comes to you and they say that they're bored, the first thing that a parent will do is they'll list off all the possibilities of things that they could do. Why don't you go read a book? Why don't you go play basketball with your friends? Why don't you go for a bike ride? Why don't you play with your Legos? So the parent just lists off all those options. And at every turn, the bored child says, nah, don't want to. Nah, don't want to. Nah, don't want to. What they're saying is they're describing for us the exact problem of boredom. What they're saying is, I want something. I recognize those things are there, but I don't want them. I want something else, and I can't tell you what that something else is. And so boredom, like in a more prosaic sort of way, boredom is that uncomfortable feeling of an unmet desire to be engaged in something meaningful.
Right. Okay. Well, as mentioned, we evolve and evolutionary. There must be a purpose for this boredom. There must be a reason. What is it according to your research?
Yeah, so that's a great point too. If this is something that we all experienced, then previously in our evolutionary history, it must have been selected for. And I think that casts boredom as an action signal. Boredom is a call to go and explore your environment for something to engage in. And we need that. So if you think about just sort of animal behavior, if an animal stays in one place for too long doing the same thing, they run two risks. One is that they'll never explore their environment for better resources. So if they're just eating berries from this bush, maybe they're nice berries, but you know what? Around the corner could be a better berry bush. The other thing that they do, if an animal stays in one place for too long doing the same thing, they run the risk of being eaten, right? So
becoming a prey.
Right. And so we need these signals. We need these self-regulatory signals that say it's time to move on. It's time to go on and explore your world for something else. And boredom is that call for exploration.
Right. And are there people who are more prone to boredom than others? Like there are people who always seem to be engaged and entertained and self-sufficient, while there are others who always need this constant stimulation. Does that have anything to do with personality, gender, age?
Yeah, so there are some effects of gender and age. So typically what we find, although it's not very strong an effect, men, you might be unsurprised to learn, tend to be more prone to boredom than women. And then the other thing that we find about age is that in those sort of early to mid teenage years, boredom is on the rise. And then when you get to the late teenage years, boredom starts to drop. And that's an important sort of age point, because in those late teenage to early 20 years, those are when the front part of your brain, that frontal cortex, is finally becoming mature. We say that you're an adult when you turn 18 or 19 in this country, but you're not really fully developed in the brain until you're about 22, 23. And so as that front part of the brain is becoming fully mature, we're getting higher capacity for self-control, better self-regulation, and you tend to get less boredom proneness. And it continues to drop into the 30s, 40s, and 50s. Although it's important to point out, it never really goes away. So it's not as though in our 30s, 40s, and 50s, we never experience boredom. We just experience it less than we did in our 20s and our teens. And then we find also that at the other end of the spectrum, that in our 60s, 70s, and 80s, that the boredom starts to rise again. Somewhat slightly, but still significantly. And that's correlated a little bit with sort of social networks that people have. So when we get into that older stage of our lives, if we have a strong social connected network, I'm not talking about Facebook here, I'm talking about actual people and actual things that you do, then those people with those strong connections tend not to be boredom prone. But people in their later years who don't have those networks do tend to experience boredom in lockstep with experiencing loneliness. And then you asked about personality, and there are some personality factors too. I mentioned self-control. People who struggle with self-control also tend to be boredom prone. People who have low self-esteem also tend to be boredom prone. And what that is about, I think, is that if you believe yourself to be an effective actor, right? So what I mean by that is that if you believe that when I set my mind to something, I will achieve it. When I set my mind to a task or a goal, I know I'll get there. If you believe that about yourself, then you're very unlikely to experience boredom that much because you see yourself as being an effective actor or an effective agent. But people who don't feel that way tend to have lower self-esteem and are more prone to boredom. And there are a few other things too. There's an association with narcissism and boredom, which is interesting in the sense that boredom is very much a self-focused experience, right? When you're bored, you all you can think about is I'm bored, I'm bored, I'm bored, and so you're not thinking about the world outside of your own head. And there's also some associations with neuroticism. So people who tend to worry a lot more also tend to be a bit more boredom prone. So there's still a lot more research to do, but there are those kinds of personality factors that are associated with boredom proneness.
Well, and how about boredom and the wealth of society? For example, sometimes I see that boredom is a privilege, something that maybe people with the means get to do, and someone who is struggling to make a living, who has three jobs, that person wish to have a few minutes of boredom. Like I remember I was running a business in which my biggest desire was to have a boring day, and I just couldn't afford it. I worked 5 years with no day off, and my biggest wish was to be bored. And we have also these rich Nordic countries who have uh, a high percentage of suicide than poor countries, and part of it is because they are bored. They have everything they want. They, all the gadgets, and they just get saturated, and they don't know what to do with themselves.
Yeah, it seems plausible, doesn't it? And it actually, that's a notion that people have brought up many years ago. So Arthur Schopenhauer, who's a sort of the forefather of existential philosophy, has quoted once as saying that the two enemies of human happiness are boredom and pain. And he's fairly explicit when he expands upon that boredom is the domain of the rich and pain is the domain of the poor, right? And so he's saying sort of exactly what you're suggesting, that if I don't have the time to sort of pause and not be, just thinking about my own survival, which involves some pain and some challenges, then I'm not likely to be bored. I don't know how to answer that in terms of today. There are certainly, I often think about when you see homeless people who might spend an entire day sitting in the one spot with a sign asking people to give them money. I often wonder that that must be an excruciatingly boring experience, and I wouldn't wish it upon anybody.
Right.
And whatever the other challenges are that they're facing, whatever the other challenges are that brought them to that difficult circumstance, trying to just eke out a little bit of money in that very monotonous way would, at least in my mind, be very boring. So I think there are circumstances that you can think of like that, where boredom will accrue in people that are not occupied in meaningful pursuits. And so you could be running 5 jobs and maybe you want time to pause, to relax or to reflect, but I don't know that you really want time to be bored. I think you just want that time to have some refresh, sort of reset experience. And then I think there's also, you can suggest that, there's some people at the uber rich end of the extreme that get to do things that none of us can even imagine doing and certainly can't afford doing. They probably are capable of occupying their time with things that are meaningful to them because they can afford anything. And so they may not be that bored either. So while I think that the answer to your question is that it's possible that having the means to live a privileged life means that you also have the luxury of boredom, but I don't know that it's that sort of strong a relationship. I do think that rich people can avoid boredom and poor people may not be able to avoid it, and so yeah, it's complex. What I would say, I guess, is that one of the things about boredom is that when you're bored, it's a sort of a threat to your sense of agency, a threat to your sense that you're pursuing goals that you want to pursue. And that might be the bigger thing. So the rich person who feels bored because they've got too much time on their hands and they've done everything in the world that they want to do, They're bored not because they're rich and not because they've already done so many different things, but they're bored because they can't think of something to do that will let them demonstrate their agency. And in a similar way, someone who doesn't have those means might feel boredom because they can't demonstrate their own agency.
Okay, well, is there any way that we can take advantage of our boredom? Let's say, yeah, I'm bored today. I accomplish all my tasks, and I find myself with an empty agenda, and I don't know what to do with myself. Hi-
Yeah, it's the $64,000 question, and or maybe I should say $64 million and bring it into modern days. But when I talk about boredom as a threat to your agency, what that ultimately means is that I can't tell you what to do to fix it. You have to tell you what to do to fix it. Just like when you said earlier, what makes you bored is not going to make someone else bored. What makes you happy won't make someone else happy. What fixes your boredom is also going to have to come from within you. It's going to have to be something that you decide upon. But the thing I think that, and it has to matter to you, right? And so there are sort of two ways that we go, it seems to me. One is that we go in a passive way. And so we occupy our minds with things that don't require much energy or effort. We might get on our phones and scroll through social media. We might get on our phones and play mindless games like Candy Crush. We might sit on the couch and just binge watch some shows on Netflix. And all of that's okay if you're doing it because you just want to relax and veg out, right? So long as you're consciously aware that that's what you're doing it. But it is a fairly passive way of letting the world just come to you and occupy your mind. The way that you can really fully conquer boredom is to be more active and to be the person that chooses the thing that you want to do to engage in. And then that becomes the challenge of figuring out what's the most meaningful thing that I can do now. And I think one of our challenges is when I use that word meaningful, that we think, well, it has to be grand. We have to, meaningful equates in our minds with a big scale. I have to, I'm bored at the moment. Now I have to do something that cures cancer, or I've got to do something that, solves some huge problem, or I see some art in your background there. I have to create some masterful art piece or do so. And I think that sets us up for failure. What we need to do is to say, I'm bored. I need to do something that allows me to showcase the fact that I'm in control, to showcase that I have skills and talents that I can deploy in the world, but I don't have to do it on a grand scale. And I'll give you an example that is going to sound fairly pathetic because it kind of is, except it worked for me. So early on in the pandemic, so I'm talking about April of last year, I found myself pretty bored at 4 o'clock in the afternoon one day. I was just thoroughly bored and I started pacing around my living room and I couldn't figure out what I wanted to do. So I phoned my mum in Australia and I asked her for a cake recipe that we used to make when I was about 10 or 12 years old. She gave me the cake recipe and I baked it. Now, who cares, right? It doesn't matter that there's nothing important. There's nothing grand about baking a cake. But you know what it did? It fixed my boredom right then and there because I chose to do it. I was occupied for half an hour, 45 minutes or whatever. And then there was a tangible product at the end of it. There were the fruits of my labors. So we need to choose to act. We need to choose to act on something that we deem meaningful to us. And we need to set appropriate expectations. You started off today when we started talking about being cooped up because of the pandemic. Well, that puts some constraints on you right there. There's a lot of things we can't do. So set realistic expectations and choose to engage in things that are, viable at this time.
Okay, well, the last question then is metaphorically, should we run from it or should we embrace it?
I think we should not do neither because I think if you can't run from it, I think eventually boredom's going to catch up to you. And I don't think you should embrace it because embracing it to me implies I should welcome boredom into my life. And I don't think you should do that. I think we should just learn from it. I think we should listen to it. So I think that's a slightly different thing than embracing it. Listen to boredom. Ask yourself, why am I bored right now? What is it about the right now and the thing I'm doing right in front of me? What is it about that makes it bored? And can I find something else that I think will be more meaningful or purposeful to me?
James, I find this topic is getting rid of my boredom. I wonder if you could tell the listeners one more time the title of the book and where they can follow you.
Yeah, so the book is called Out of My Skull: The Psychology of Boredom by myself and my co-author John Eastwood. You can follow me on Twitter. It's just James Dankert, and also you can check out my website, which if you just put jamesdankert.com, all lowercase, then you'll find out more about my research.
And congratulations on the book title. It couldn't be more descriptive. And also to the graphic designer who created the little graphic on the front of the book. It's very appropriate. James, thank you so much for your time.
Absolutely, my pleasure.